Nietzsche is the missing piece in the new atheist arguments.
Mm.
So like the Sam Harrises, the Richard Dawkins, they forward a form of atheism. But Nietzsche's form of atheism has something which theirs don't. Not just the God is dead, but also the courage of confronting the abyss and the
Mm.
emotional dimension of confronting the abyss. And I feel like that equation in Nietzsche is missing in our society. It's very common today to say we live in a post-religious society or we don't really believe in God. What has opened up instead is this sort of hedonistic nihilism. And in Nietzsche, it's not just God is dead, it's that the terror and the emotional impact of God's death means that you need to have the courage to become the overman.
Cadell last. Welcome to the Metagame.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So you're a philosopher. Your background's also in anthropology, and you focus on biocultural evolution, mind-matter relation, and speculative futures. But there's one blurb that really struck me, and it kind of connected with my experience of you when I first encountered your stuff, maybe in 2020. And I'll just tell you what that was like. You seem like a lifelong truth seeker, someone who's not afraid to pursue truth come what may. And it's almost as if that journey started in a more academic, philosophical, abstract, intellectual place. And then eventually, just by the desire to stay in integrity, it led you down this path of embodiment and practice. And that's the impression I got. And then I saw this blurb, which totally mapped onto that. So I'm going to read it to you, and I'd love to hear you add to it or edit it in case things have changed. But it said, paradoxes and contradictions in your embodied performance led you to a deeper spiritual and analytical inquiry, which included psychoanalysis, men's work, circling, and a realization of how sexual energy informs knowing. So there's so many things in that I'd love to unpack. But would you say this is accurate for Cadell last today?
Yeah, I wrote that probably in the last year or something like that. It's definitely a way of describing my path, I think. I could go deeper into that if you want.
I'd love that. Maybe give us a glimpse of the origin story for how someone ends up in a journey like that.
Yeah. Um well, in regards to the abstract to the embodied level, I'd want to almost hypothesize that is a journey that many Western intellectuals have taken. So I don't think I'm necessarily unique in that regard, but it does have um, a relationship to, I think, the way we conceptualize universality.
Hmm.
So let me unpack a little bit what I mean by that is that I think that spontaneously, and this might have a deeper sort of developmental um, relationship to maybe the human mind and the way the human mind sort of comes to understand universality. But the way I think that it manifested in me is that there's this attempt at what I would call an abstract universality.
Mm-hmm.
And an abstract universality, I mean, I have a sort of an understanding of all of the major disciplines, cosmology, physics, chemistry, biology, anthropology, sort of getting a big history point of view of all phenomena known to observation. But then you're sort of, at least in my experience, you're kind of left with a very weird feeling, which is you have this sort of abstract universality, but you know, around the dinner table with your family, or I remember even like talking to like my third girlfriend about big history, and she just was like blank stare,
Mm.
like didn't care. Like I'm with my family, and like it seemed like the things that were really meaningful, like for example, I don't want to like reveal too much, but like for example, problems of alcoholism or um you know uh intimate tensions, like midlife crises, divorces,
Hmm.
all of these things going on in the environment, which is like most immediate, which is most concrete. And it's like I'm here with my abstract universality, and I'm like, this doesn't like there's something I'm missing here.
Right.
There's something that's not quite working, or there's something that I'm not cluing into. I guess there was like this unconscious presupposition that if I learn enough in this relationship to abstract universality, that somehow I would become some figure of knowing that would be able to resolve the tensions in day-to-day life or something like that. That I'm not saying I explicitly thought that, but I think that maybe there's something unconscious going on there, that I was gonna resolve something,
Hmm.
um, that was going on in a more concrete, immediate way. Um, but, the basic paradox or the contradiction that brought me back to the singularity of myself, and as it relates to abstract universality, I think that abstract universality through these negativities becomes a concrete universality, which is the paradox is that it moves through the particular,
Hmm.
meaning that the universality is no longer this abstract representation of all the phenomena, but it's actually something moving through your day-to-day cracks. And so that's sort of like where I had the perspective change on my motion and my relationship to universality. And I suppose that now informs a lot of the way in which I read um, intellectual systems.
Hmm.
I get very skeptical of intellectual systems which are not coming from a deeply personal place, because I feel like it's a avoidance of this negativity. You know, the
Hmm.
alcoholism, the divorce, the intimate tensions, the does your girlfriend care about what you're doing actually, like all of these things are now more primary, and that's like more where my learning comes from.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I really liked about your work. I noticed that most philosophers, they speak with a distance, like a cognitive distance from the things that they're critiquing, almost as if they're standing outside of some edifice that they have uh, a complete view of. And you've very explicitly in some of your lectures included yourself in the thing that you're describing and made it very personal. And to me, as someone who's encountering that lecture, it also has that effect on myself, because when you're describing the particular aspects of your life, the details of your life, I remember you were talking about Nietzsche and this theme of solitude, and then you took a tangent to describe how solitude has impacted your development. And then it just makes me think of my own solitude, and it re-enlivens what otherwise might seem like a very cold cerebral activity.
And that's I just want to say quickly that that's to me the meaning of concrete universality, is that the more you go personal, the
Mm.
more you become universal. Because
Yes.
like I describe my experience of solitude, but it resonates in the other. And that's sort of I think the little flip there.
Yeah, the personal is universal.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's almost like an affirmation for this conversation. So I resist the urge um, to not include myself in what we talk about. And maybe that's a good way for me to say one of the reasons why I was particularly interested in speaking with you. And it's that in the last, I would say, 6 months or so, I've been drawn more and more to Nietzsche and his articulation of what's been going on in the West. And I've had like Nietzsche phases all throughout my life, starting like with most men, when you're in your early 20s. Um, but yeah, lately I've just been so drawn to what he had to say. And there's so many different entry points into this conversation. But I guess the one that feels salient to me right now is Nietzsche's emphasis on the body, and how, in a sense, he was like the last philosopher, and he was criticizing all these abstract intellectual architectures that prior philosophers were creating, and instead opted for something that was a lot more primal and embodied. Um, and I think you see that in his like aphoristic style as well, where instead of creating a complete like argument for some complete platonic form of something. He's just inviting you to participate in the process of thinking, in the experience of thinking. And that's just been so alive to me lately. And then I encountered your work, and it seems like Nietzsche has had a big influence on you. So maybe you can tell us what that journey with Nietzsche was like. Did you also have an experience when you were in your early 20s, and then kind of like a re-encounter as you understood him more deeply?
Actually, not that's not my relation. Although I know that that is a common path of sort of experiencing Nietzsche as a young man, and then coming to him a little later. My path's a little different. Um, my path was basically that I didn't really get into philosophy until I was maybe in my later 20s.
Mm,
And the reason why was because I was so focused on science. Um, and whatever I do, I tend to give it a sort of a laser focus, and I definitely was kind of in the ideology of thinking, like a Stephen Hawking or a Richard Dawkins style of thinking, like, you know philosophy is kind of outdated. When
mm,
I was this is in my early 20s, thinking philosophy is a little outdated, and almost thinking as if science can replace philosophy. And that all the big questions that philosophers used to answer about, the fundamental nature of things could now be taken over by the evolutionary biologies and the quantum
mm,
cosmologies and stuff like this. But I did encounter Nietzsche through my interest in transhumanism first, because there are some transhumanist philosophers that I was really into, and one in particular, Max Moore, was trying to basically take some of the foundational principles of Nietzsche and inscribing them into transhumanism. So that's sort of where I first encountered Nietzsche's ideas. But my sort of relationship to Nietzsche, as it sort of developed once I got into philosophy, was basically saying that Nietzsche's the missing piece in the new atheist arguments.
mm.
So like when the new atheist arguments, like the Sam Harris's, the Richard Dawkins, the Christopher Hitchens, um, they forward a type of a form of atheism, and Nietzsche also forwards a form of atheism. But Nietzsche's form of atheism has something which theirs don't, in my opinion, which is that embodied personal context, and also not just the God is dead, but also the courage of confronting the abyss and the
Mm,
emotional dimension of confronting the abyss. And I feel like that equation in Nietzsche is missing in our society. Is like, it's very common today to say we live in a post-religious society, or we don't really believe in God the way pre-modern people supposedly believed in God, in the sense of like going to war for God, and like know there's century long battles over different religious interpretations and stuff. We don't believe like that.
mhm.
Um uh but that what has opened up instead is this sort of hedonistic nihilism. And in Nietzsche, it's like always connected, is that it's not just God is dead, it's that the terror and the emotional impact of God's death means that um, you need to have the courage to become the overman.
Yeah.
Basically, you need to be a human overcoming, because if you're not a human overcoming, then you fall into this hedonistic loop. And this hedonistic loop is, I think, what he refers to as the last man, which has no capacity to overcome himself or herself.
Yeah,
So I
maybe
think
we
that and the emotional weight of that.
maybe we can define some of these terms. So the last man, the overman, and the abyss.
Yeah. So what you want to think here is that, so God is like a objective background for um a society under a Christian metaphysics or an Islamic metaphysics or some sort of monotheistic order. Um the death of God opens up a background that's abyssal, so that it's
Mm,
like in I want to make almost like a strange comparison here with like with physics, because in Newtonian physics you have a background of absolute space-time,
mhm.
And then in a lot in quantum gravity, they talk about a background independence, meaning that there is no background. You lose the background. And I think that's happening in the theological dimension with Nietzsche, is that you have a background which is God, and then you lose that background, and there's a background independence, but that's the abyss you're confronting. There's no more background. So that's how I understand abyss. And so what unifies humans after, in Nietzsche, I suppose, is the double move of losing the background and then confronting the abyssal background. And that's sort of where the potential, now it's a void, but it's a void potential.
Hmm.
So there's a potentiality in the void. And that's sort of where the I guess the relation between the last man and the overman appears. Is you either you sort of are like you succumb to the spirit of gravity in Nietzsche, which would be the last man succumbs to the spirit of gravity. Like it's like you can't overcome.
Hmm.
You're just falling. You're falling into simple pleasure. You're falling into simple immediacy. You're giving up because what does it matter anyway? All the ultimate meanings are gone. So what does it matter anyway? That I do anything?
Right.
Whereas the overman is a creative overcoming of not just yourself, but even the human condition. And I think that's something I try to emphasize in the courses is that I'm teaching a course on this book, Zarathustra, is that Nietzsche isn't really even so much a friend of humanity.
Mm.
Like he's not a humanist.
Right.
Like he even says, like, explicitly, like in the opening, like he's like, humans are only lovable as a overcoming. Like humans are only lovable as a going beyond themselves.
As a bridge.
Yeah, it's a bridge. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have this, and it's very emotional because, there is a way in which we can spontaneously think about the human being as an eternal form.
Mm.
Even if like, so for example, like you mentioned Plato with the forms, like you can on a certain so back to abstract universality, like on a certain abstract universality, you can say, we don't need Plato, whatever, the eternal forms, that's nonsense. But then you say, well, human form, human being, we're transient, we're going to be overcome, there's going to be something that replaces us, or we're going to overcome ourselves and there'll be a different form. Well, can you really take that emotionally, like concretely?
Mm.
That's tough. That's a process.
Yeah.
It's going to be some tears.
So I'd like to tie the abyss, the last man, the overman, with my own personal journey, because I think those touch points, and actually a couple others, like the death of God, maps onto my life. I was raised as a Christian, and I still remember what it was like. I still have glimmers in my mind for what it was like to live in an ontology where God was real, where you could commune with him, where there was this higher power that had a certain interest in the decisions and the choices you made, and also could equip you in making the best choices. And one of the principles of my particular flavor of Christianity when I was, a kid and teenager in high school, was this emphasis on knowing what God's will was. Because, I could have an idea of what God wants and it could be wrong. It's probably wrong. So there's this humility in understanding what God actually wants. And that's I see that now as a metaphor for this truth-seeking impulse. And that eventually led to me asking deeper questions about the religion that I was raised in, because I had to pursue the truth, not my idea of God. And then eventually, you saw off the branch that you're sitting on, and then you descend into the abyss. And I remember in undergrad, I struggled a lot with meaning and motivating myself to do anything. And I'm so glad that I didn't have ideas like the psychiatric notions of depression floating around in my head, because I think that would have been something that would have worked against me. But instead, I was able to. So there's like a last man period in a sense, or the temptations of the last man, of the kind of this hedonistic escape from the abyss. I definitely felt that. And then the way out, and I was actually saying this to Benito Roy recently, the thing that helped me overcome that was embodied practices. Like, it sounds very trivial, but I remember when I first started taking cold showers, I stopped feeling quote unquote depressed because the cold water would put my body into like a fight or flight state. And then I'd get out of my head. Maybe this is what you mean by conceptual universality or abstract universality. And then I'd be thrown into the moment and in the particulars of my body. And in that world, in the physical world, there's actually concrete things you can do to overcome. And now that I, more recently read Nietzsche, I see that he's always talking about the body and its significance. So, yeah, I wonder if you can expand on why Nietzsche was so. I have some ideas why Nietzsche was so concerned about the body, but why do you think he was?
Well, I think, well, yeah, thanks for that story. It's always good to know people's path through these dimensions and these questions, and it always gives sort of like a parallax view.
Mm.
I think at least what comes across as one of the most powerful notions in Thus Spoke Zarathustra for me is, he says, the soul is body and nothing but the body.
Mm.
So it's just this idea that when we think about the soul, we usually think about it as some extra material separate from the body. And we imagine it as getting some sort of heavenly body. And I think as a consequence of that, we don't listen to the voice of the body because we don't think it has anything to tell us. We don't think it has anything to say to us.
Mm-hmm.
We in so many ways disrespect the body. And I suppose there is this unconscious image, whether someone's identifying as religious or not. I think that there's this unconscious image of wanting a heavenly body.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that comes in the transhumanist worldview too. And that's something I encountered in the scientific world, which is you want a heavenly body. It's not going to be this body. But this is coming as a consequence of it's in the gap of not listening to the body and not listening to the intelligence of the body. And I think that's one of the greatest paradoxes of the modern evolutionary world, because on the one hand, in the modern evolutionary world, you have this idea that, well, we're all products of evolution. We're all
Mm-hmm.
products of life. We're these organic processes. But at the same time, you don't listen to the body. Right? Like, and I think that's the paradox of, like, even the performativity, the historical performativity of the evolutionary biologists.
Mm.
Because the historical performativity of the evolutionary biologist should be much more in tune with the primal body, than it is. So like it's just that there is however many billions of years of intelligence here in the present. And that information has survived for billions of years. It's an immortal gene line. And so for Nietzsche, that is the soul, and that is the pathway to the soul, and a pathway to, he's almost saying, get rid of all the images in your head of, like, almost maybe similar to what, because I think there's paradoxes there, because it's, there are some similarities with maybe what you were told in the Christian tradition of, don't listen to your ideas of what God is. But he's almost saying, like, get all the metaphysical imagery out of your head.
Mm-hmm.
You're so disconnected from yourself that any of your ideas are nonsense.
Right.
So let's just get out all your ideas. Even to bring in the Hegelian dialectic here for a sec, is that even Hegel says, in regards to the dialectical process, he says, don't bring your bright ideas. You don't need to bring your bright ideas. Because you don't know yourself well enough to know even the foundations of your ideas.
Hmm.
so it's basically, Nietzsche is trying to get in touch with a primal intelligence of the psyche. And that's one of the another interesting things is that because the dualism of the psyche and the body is dissipated, you know his notion of the psyche is bodily.
Hmm. Hmm.
His notion of the psyche is bodily. So there's basically, and there I would actually bring in Freud for a moment, because for Freud, the you don't really know what the body in itself is, but you always know the body through the mind, but the mind is totally bodily.
Hmm.
So it's just an intelligence, in the body, which is, I suppose, what you could call the primary process of the mind.
Hmm. What the quote I'm reminded of is Nietzsche said, "Never trust a thought you had indoors," or something like that, or like all best thinking is done when walking. And
Right.
I think that connects exactly to what you're saying, and it's also true. I notice that if I spend too much time indoors, as it is easy to do these days when a lot of your work is digital, your personality changes. And often, actually, last week I did this experiment where I had this thought. I was like, maybe movement is the highest form of intelligence. And if that's the case, what would it be like if I started my days where within 5 minutes of waking up, I was out the door? How would that change the rest of the day? And I did that, and I noticed I was so much more aggressive and willful with everything else I did that day. I had almost an impatience with the pace of everything else. And that allowed me to actually get so much more done. Not that that was the goal, but there was something about just, I guess, reclaiming myself as a, as a being in motion, because
Mhm.
otherwise I'd wake up, go to my computer and start writing or something, and I'd, be still for many hours of the day. So, um, there was a lot of practical wisdom in that.
Yeah, I think that's I mean, the point there, I think that's most connected to Nietzsche, is that, you know the spirit of gravity is trying to bring you down and almost deaden your motivational systems.
Mm,
And one of the interesting things about the fictional character of Zarathustra, which I think there's a lot of truth in the fictional character of Zarathustra that Nietzsche's developing there, which is, he's not this enlightened being that's sitting still.
hmm.
You meet him and he's hiking. He's talking to his animals, and the animals are saying, "Zarathustra, do you want to go on a big hike today?" And he's like, "Yeah, yeah, it's a great idea. Let's go
Mm,
on a big hike today." Like, and so, like, you get this idea of a being that's in perpetual motion. And I think that there is an unconscious death drive where people actually want things to stop,
right.
where people want things, like, there's actually a part in Thus Spoke Zarathustra where Nietzsche's having, like, it's almost like, I call it like an intimate partner fight with life.
Mm,
Like how, like, husbands and wives have a fight.
right.
He's like having that fight with life itself. And he's like saying, he's basically saying how much he loves life, and life responds to him saying, "You don't love life as much as you say you love life." And, she's
Hmm.
almost like, she's almost like saying, "You don't love me as much as you say you love me, but you don't love me." And this type this type of stuff, which is, it's funny to read it in that way. But there's this way in which he's getting at this part of our mind, which actually does want things to stop. That
Mm,
death drive. And so I think there is this wisdom in staying, and maybe there is a point where all human beings go through that valley of death, of encountering that desire to stop. And there's the possibility that you come out on the other side of that with a new invigoration and a new motion.
mm, mm.
Mm.
Yeah. So, what this brings up is something we said at the beginning, which was in your blurb. You said you're curious about how sexual energy informs knowing. And to me, that's like the opposite of the death drive. So there's also this uh, libidinal energy that
Mhm.
is the life drive. And that's, to me, that's such an interesting question. How does sexual energy inform knowing? What did you mean by that question? And do you have any clues for its answer?
Yeah, so, like, let me give, like, a very practical, personal example is, like, I spent basically 12 or 13 years building up towards, getting my doctorate, like, when the dream originally formed,
Mm,
and, and then, when I finally, um, finished the process, I always had this I had a confrontation with myself, basically, because I always had this underlying assumption, I suppose, that again, something was gonna be resolved by me finishing this process.
yeah.
Um, you could say there's a death drive in there, but but the truth of the confrontation with myself was that here I am, you know, achieving my dream at so-called the peak of a social performance or hierarchy, and my sexual life was just a mess.
Mm,
My and the thing is that it's humbling because you have all these complex ideas, you've got all these professors, asking you questions, saying, good job and stuff like this. And then there's something actually that's very simple and very stupid in some sense, this sexual urge, which is undermining your entire life,
yeah.
and so the basically the idea I have here is you've got to start with the foundations of your being, which can be humiliating, which can be humbling, which can break your entire structure of ideas, and it's sort of building from a more real foundation. I guess it's like the core repetition of concrete universality. I
Mm,
would say, like, that's the core repetition of concrete universality is that sexual impulse and that sexual drive, because, it's literally where life comes from. It's literally where creativity comes from. It's literally where you came from.
right.
Like, you were once that impulse. Like, literally, literally, and it's weird to think about it, but, it's you're going to the ground of yourself quite literally. And
So,
you learn a lot about yourself by investigating, like, the intelligence of the images in your head about that. Like they're telling you something, they're screaming at you. Like I was just like I told you before we started recording, I was watching a documentary on Jeffrey Dahmer, and Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer, but he was deeply sexually repressed.
mm,
He's battling with his sexual images that he can't process. He can't understand them. He's tortured by them. And but I think that expresses the point well, which is that if you're not really in tune with the fundamental libidinal repetitions of your body, you're going to be self-tortured,
mm,
and I think and accepting something, and it's not like it's easy to, like, it's weird. We live in a society where, that's one of the reasons I got into men's circles a little bit, was because it's not there's not many outlets to, like, talk about what turns me on,
mhm,
what really gets me going, what do I want in a sexual partner, and here talking about the more sexual dimensions, like, what do I want in bed and how do I want to perform in bed, right? Like, these things are, like, and especially, like, when I if I just think about, you know um this dimension of myself is, like, it's where I encounter very also childlike emotions.
yeah.
Like, 'cause if I don't perform up to my own notion, or if I don't feel like I'm being recognized as I would like to be recognized, I can feel hurt. I can feel sad. I can feel like I'm upset that I have to communicate my desire. Like, I have to say, this is what I would like, or this is how I would like our relationship to be, or this is what I would like us to work on,
Mhm,
together. and to communicate that, there's almost like this feeling of a resistance, like it should happen without me saying it.
Hmm.
So and you encounter these childlike emotions sometimes because you're being pulled back to your ground.
Which explains why people would resist it. And I think nowadays there's so many convenient ways to fully escape. You mentioned the transhumanists, and to me, like I don't know, maybe I'm not being fair to them, but they represent kind of like the apotheosis of disembodiment. Uploading your psyche to the metaverse. And I would say that in a way, the metaverse is already here because most of the challenges that modern people face are challenges of abundance as opposed to scarcity. Like there's too much refined carbohydrates and processed food. There's too much porn. There's too much stimulation and supernormal stimuli on the internet. And so it's very easy for that internal tension that you just described of, the inner child, sexual drive, questions about what turns you on, how to have like an integrated sexuality, like all that complexity can just be diffused by escaping into technology. And I think that brings us to The Last Man, and also part of the reason why I think Nietzsche feels very alive. Do you think that The Last Man is already here in a sense, with all the Netflix and Uber Eats and social media and digital escapism?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Yeah, and the thing is that the last man, like this, it's a weird thing, this notion of the last man, because the last man, I think, is a function of our success.
Hmm.
Meaning, the last man is a function of the fact that we're no longer in scarcity. The last man is a function of our technological capacities. The last man is a function of, in some sense, the scientific paradigm allowing for so much hyper efficiency. That in many ways, human beings never had a chance to be the last man before now,
That's right.
because
Yeah.
like I was whenever I was talking to my granddad telling me about his childhood, I was like, you know, he's like he's sleeping in a room with he's sharing a room with 9 other siblings.
Mm,
Like he's dealing with constraints which are just unfathomable for most modern people living in a developed country. So I think the thing is that the loss of those constraints, which are just naturally imposed and in which a lot of civilization has been trying to reduce or eliminate those constraints, now confronts us with the situation where we have to basically develop our own constraints.
hmm.
Like so, for example, the cold shower example is an example of a certain paradoxical constraint where you're putting yourself into something which is inherently uncomfortable.
Yeah,
Instead of having a warm shower, think about throughout history how many people would have killed to have a daily warm shower.
that's right.
Like almost everyone. But that's the weird paradoxical reversal of human civilization, is like now we've got the possibility to have a warm shower whenever we like. I could have as many as I want in the day,
Hmm.
basically. And like we get up and have a cold shower. Because we've got to generate sort of that tension. And I think that's the thing. And I think staying with the tension is the motion,
Hmm.
instead
Hmm.
of wanting the tension to be over. And it's so tempting for our minds to want the tension to be over, and I think for me, like I'm trying to like it is constantly, I have to remind myself constantly, it's not something that you just, it's not a linear thing where you just get out of it. I think I think even like when you study Zarathustra's speech, like he's internally struggling.
Mm.
Like he's from the start an enlightened being, but he's still internally struggling with things. And I pay attention to that in the course, is that not only his teaching to the other humans, but also his own tensions, that he's going through. So but in regards to like keeping that tension alive is like, so for example, is like you have this feeling like I described when I was finishing my PhD, or like when I released my PhD thesis, was like you're gonna somehow, there's some unconscious, something's gonna be resolved,
Hmm.
and like for example, whatever creative project I do, there's this unconscious thing where like eventually it's going to be resolved, but you have to constantly remind yourself, no, the thing is the constant creativity and the tension, that's what you want too, like, and so like it's almost like, the images of whatever it is, the money or the fame or the what recognition or whatever is like, that's not actually the thing, and it's a weird feeling to remind yourself that it's not the thing, because like I've had situations where, you get the money or you get the recognition or you get the whatever, that you think you want, but it's actually, you realize, like, if you reflect on those moments, you realize very quickly that's not the thing.
Yeah.
So what you want is just to keep creatively, I think the money and the fame and the recognition are just proxies. They're not the foundational cause of your motion. They're almost like proxies for a sign that you could keep going.
Hmm.
Because if people are recognizing you, or if you get some funding or something like that, well, that means I can keep going.
Right, right. Yeah, it's a couple analogies, quite naturally come to mind. Like it's almost like you're describing a tantric approach to life where you're not aiming for orgasm. You're aiming to kind of play with the sexual energy and the sexual tension. And to me, the place where that feels very clear, other than the sexual context, is with music. Because in a piece of music, if all you did was like resolve the tension, that's being created by notes and harmonies, then you wouldn't have a piece of music. And music is like the sonic play of tension. And you create a lot of it. And it's in the most tense moments that there's the most potential for emotion. And there's this idea in Nietzsche as well that the best way to live is to see your life as a work of art. And to me, that's been, in a way, like the minimum viable philosophy for popping out of the meaning crisis, because I don't need to answer bigger cosmological questions or metaphysical questions, because I understand aesthetic experiences. I understand when I'm experiencing beauty and how life is self-justified in those moments. I understand when I listen to a beautiful piece of music, I'm not I'm not upset that it's going to end. It's sufficient in a way. It's complete in a way. It's complete in its incompleteness. And if you just live like that, if you see all of your life as a work of art, then to me that's a pretty decent response to the abyss. Uh, I wonder if you think of that, and maybe you can riff on this idea of Nietzsche's idea that life is only ever really justified as an aesthetic phenomena.
Right. Well, I relate to that. Like, so for example, like it's almost like, you're in the right spot kind of thing.
Mm.
Um, like I have the phenomenon where if I find a song I really like, I just put it on a loop,
Oh yeah.
and you don't want, you just keep going with it. Like, and it's like, and I know that when I'm in my creative drive as well, like where you're not even thinking about the end of it. You're just in the creative drive and you're enjoying the creative drive itself. And for me, like, and maybe this is like also the reason why I had a relationship to embodied practices, even during my academic time, was because I was always into sports.
Mm.
And for me, like when I was playing, especially when I was in high school and or my early 20s, was like the mentality of an athlete. Like the mentality of an athlete when you're playing the game, when you're in the game, you're just there in the game. And when the game's over, the first thing you'd like is for there to be another game.
Mm.
Like in baseball, for example, you play every day, and the game's over, then tomorrow we have another game and just keep going. I remember I remember talking to some kid who or a guy in high school who didn't understand my interest in sports, and specifically he was asking me about sports video games, and he was saying, well, what happens when you finish the season in your game? I was like, well, we just start a new season.
Yeah.
You go on to the next season. So it just keeps going, and you just want it to keep going, right? And so there is a feeling of life is self justified in those. in those moments, like you're saying. And it's also like it's a type of overcoming of yourself too. And it's probably the experiences. I'd imagine I'm not a musician, but I mean, imagine if you are a musician that there's a type of self-overcoming in learning how to be a musician, and also an elevation of your spirit in the actual playing of the music and the dramatization of the whole experience, which is a type of self-overcoming. And I know in sports that's how it feels. It's like a self-overcoming when you, because I mean, you're doing something which is inherently challenging and difficult. I mean, you're exhausted and tired at the end of it. Right? Like, you're not
Yeah.
sitting on the couch. And so, yeah, I put those two in line, as the music and sport, as examples of ways in which that tension can become not only enjoyable, but it's like this surplus. I always had this feeling ever since I was a kid of like that there's something lacking, something missing. And
Hmm.
I had these feelings like, whether it's sports or music, um, where there's this surplus. Like, life is not only enough, but it's over enough.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good times.
I'm reminded of when I first started lifting weights and
Mhm.
how I was driven by a goal of like strength and physical fitness and acquiring a certain physique. And then eventually, I remember there was like this torturous moment where I was under a barbell squatting a heavy weight, and there's like this thought, like, what the fuck am I doing? Like, it's just so much pain and all of this. And then I realized that something shifted where it just became something I do. And it was as if, the physical gains were secondary. Like one day I'm going to look at myself in the mirror and be like, oh yeah, look, I look a bit bigger, a bit stronger. But that was no longer what was driving me. But that encounter with my own edge that I experienced under the barbell, that's what was driving me. And that now this is just something I do. It's not like, if someone asks like, why do you do it? I wouldn't really, it would feel like a silly question in a way. Like I could give an answer, but it would be kind of made up. And the real answer could only have been found in that moment where everything was really clear, past and future fall away. And all you're doing is just sending signals through your nervous system as much as you possibly can so that you can put this bar back on the rack. And that comes to mind. I think this is also a good way to segue into this idea of vitality, which is present in Nietzsche and absent in contemporary society. I'll share a personal thing. I've done a lot of I guess like exploration into personal development, philosophy. Perhaps starting with resolving the death of God in my own life. And about 3 years ago, I noticed that one of the most common threads, probably the most consistent thread from when I was a kid to now, was that I was in search of vitality. Basically, like, if there was one thing that I was really looking for, it was to wake up every morning and feel that sense of complete aliveness that I would sometimes feel, honestly, as a Christian, when I'd feel connected to God. I'd feel like the Holy Spirit was like coursing through me. And then I had different moments, like, the cold shower, weightlifting, in my dating life, whenever I had the courage to approach really attractive women. All these things would just make me feel alive. Even talking about it now, I'm noticing my heart rate's going up like a little bit in a very excited way. And I I named that a few years ago. I realized, okay, you know what? Like, maybe I don't fully understand who I am and what I'm trying to do, but this seems like pretty clear. And more of this, at least for now, while I'm in my late 20s and 30s, early 30s, I think this is worth pursuing. And then I noticed these themes in Nietzsche, and I also noticed how our time is a very unvital time. You meet people and they're kind of even people who are practicing things. They're kind of practicing. I don't know, how do I say this without being uncharitable? Uh, it's like, I have a lot of friends who practice meditation, and I noticed that I had a complex relationship with meditation because to me it was moving in the opposite direction. It was creating it was like more like a death drive was making me want to meditate, or there was this escape from life or my friend calls it like emptiness maxing. You just enter like the void itself and identify with it. While what really motivates me is transcending the void and becoming alive. Um, yeah, I'd love to hear your personal experiences with that, and if that framing of vitality resonates, and then maybe if you can tell us how Nietzsche thought about vitality.
Well, I say I think there's a strange relationship between life and death. I think it's a very, very strange relationship. I wouldn't pretend to know all the answers to that strange tension, but in regards to my own life, I do feel like there is a spontaneous vitality that we have as children,
Hmm.
and actually, I'll connect it a little bit to Nietzsche already, because I think there's a triadic structure in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which connects the entire book, which is the camel, the lion, and the child. But in order to get to that metaphor of the camel, the lion, and the child for a sec, I think when we're children, we have this spontaneous vitality, and then because of the demands of civilization, here you can think along the lines of like Freud's civilization and its discontents.
Hmm.
You have to become a camel. It's almost like this relationship between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. There's a tension here between the pleasure principle and the reality principle, which is dramatizing itself out, from the first desire to be with the mother, to feel safe and protected and have pleasure from the mother.
Hmm.
Um, to, when you're an infant, all you have to do is cry and you get what you want if you have a good mother.
Right.
Yeah, you just gotta cry and then you get what you want. But I mean, when you're 18, just crying isn't gonna cut it. You gotta learn language, you gotta learn all complex social rules and so forth. And there's this whole dance that goes into becoming an adult. And anyway, the whole point of the camel is that you have to take some sort of responsibility, you have to carry a heavy load. And in some sense, you carry a heavy load for carrying a heavy load's sake. Like, so for example, in when you were talking about lifting weights and your original sort of, why am I doing this? I'm just carrying a heavy load. But then you realize, oh, I'm trying to get to the edge, and that's the lion, which is the lion wants to go to the edge, doesn't want to just carry a heavy load to carry a heavy load. It wants to figure out its own desire.
Mm.
It wants to figure out, why am I doing this? It wants to go deeper. Um, but in any case, in my life, I feel like um, there's a way in which, if you make certain compromises with society, broadly speaking, like, I can give practical examples of what I mean with making compromises with society. So like, ever since I was an intellectual, I was always, I think, driven by a very genuine intellectual thirst and curiosity.
Hmm.
But I had to make several compromises with the university to get through the game. Right. So like, when I was in my master's program, I did my master's at the University of Toronto, and I really wanted to get into this anthropology program at the University of Toronto. And I ended up getting into the program on the condition that I was studying under someone who was an expert in lemurs. And I didn't care about lemurs, but I did it, and I built my true passion on the side. That's when I was getting into YouTube and blogging and stuff. So it was kind of like, on the side I was doing that while I was playing the game of doing the lemur research. But then for my PhD, I was saying, I'm not going to make that same compromise to do my PhD, because that's a much more time, and I want to make sure if I'm doing my PhD, it's in something where I'm really passionate about it. And so I took a year off to make sure I got into the program where I had the freedom to do what I wanted to do, and I ended up getting a program where I could study the technological singularity, which is what I was really passionate about at the time. But this story is just to say that you have to make so many constraints with society in order to sort of move up the ladder, and then that can sort of deaden that childlike vitality. Basically, it's
Yeah.
almost like the child gets buried underneath that weight of the camel. Like, to do that hard grind, that hard, that heavy lifting. Um, And I think that's where the temptation to identify with the void comes from. And that's where the sort of the identity with the death drive kicks in, because you just want to get rid of the heavy load and you want to be nothing and you want to disappear. And I have that feeling too. You just want to disappear. And the thing is like, we're not like a video game system. You can't just turn us off, like
Mm.
I can't just turn this off, like that's suicide, right? So you can't just turn it off. I feel heavy. I want to feel not heavy, but I can't turn myself off at the same time. So, after my PhD, for example, I call that my void times,
Mm.
my lack times. And that's why I did a series on my YouTube channel called The Philosophy of Lack, which was reinvestigating concepts in philosophy through the idea of lack. But in any case, on a personal level, what was happening in my life with identification with lack was that I was going into deep fasting, or I was going into deep meditation, right? And with deep fast, or I was going into deep celibacy,
Mm.
right? Like all lack, right? All retraction, all nothingness, instead of a positivity, instead of a vitality, instead of eating or your sexual drive, or being um even an ego in motion,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's all positive drives. But meditation and fasting and celibacy or abstinence, these are all identifications with the void. And at one point I took that very far. Like, so for example, the deepest I did was a 3 day a 3 day dry fast, which is no food and no water.
Whoa.
And like by the third day of the dry fast, I was like, I couldn't even walk really. Like I was moving slowly.
What possessed
you
you to do that?
I got obsessed with fasting. I think it
Mm.
was because I wanted to sort of have some sort of control over my oral drive, because I think the oral drive takes you the deepest. Because the oral drive takes you to the deepest recesses of the childlike mind, because like what's the first thing the baby wants is milk. Was suck on the mother's breast or whatever. So like I always notice that whenever you play, and I played with that, and you have to sort of endure these childlike emotions. Like I remember the first day I started fasting, I cried, and because it was the first day in my life I hadn't eaten.
Mm.
It was the 24. I hadn't gone a 24-hour period without eating. It
Wow.
was a repetition I had done every day of my life. So then I stopped doing it, and you encounter, and all those emotions come up, and so I call that the identification with the void. But or you can call that the identification with the void. But um this is where there's that weird relationship between life and death, because going through that void, there was something necessary in that, I think, because it was a clear, like I even remember the first day I started like seriously meditating. It was like I couldn't sit still for like 10 minutes, and there was all these weird images coming into my head. And
Mm-hmm.
now I can sit still quite easily. But and I got pretty, whatever it means to be good at meditation, just being still and just being capable of being still. But there's something that I gained a certain subjective depth by doing those types of things, because I think you're literally brought to your metaphorical umbilical cord.
Mm.
And Freud called um that the void basically the navel of the dream, which I think is a nice metaphor. The navel of the dream. Imagine that image in your head. It's like,
Yeah.
because you're brought to the core of the birth of your dreams, and that's again the void potential. Um, so like I feel like you go through a potential rebirth, and then there's a life on the other side of that. And I even think, like, for example, in Christian metaphysics, I mean, the story of Jesus being on the cross and dying and then being resurrected, like that's a metaphor for this. You're in life, and then you encounter negativity, and then you get reborn on the other side.
Well, also the
So
40 days in the desert
another
without
interesting
food.
one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And you clear yourself out, and then he sees God, right? And all right, like he has some experience, like some transcendental experience, because you cleared yourself out.
Yeah, there's a relationship with asceticism and vitality, and the image comes to mind where, in my life, when I notice that I'm not pursuing the things that matter to me with the fervor that I would like, it's almost always because I am overstimulated or oversaturated by the abundance of modern life. And the mode I go into once I notice that is not quite as extreme as what you described, but it is a form of asceticism. And it's basic things like I limit my screen time. I completely block out these hyper stimulating websites like YouTube and Instagram. My phone goes on black and white. I might do fasting or intermittent fasting, skip breakfast. But there's this asceticism that comes online that becomes very clarifying. And it's almost like you realize that you were at a certain point in the mountain, that you're climbing up the mountain and you got stuck. And so you have to go all the way back to the base of the mountain, and then you stay there for a little bit. And then out of that place, some new vital impulse emerges, and then you climb up the mountain from a completely different path, or you do so with more energy. And to me, that these cycles, I guess, of absence and excess, I think are kind of what you were saying earlier. That's a tension that we're not meant to resolve. Maybe it's something we just play with and oscillate through.
Yeah, I'm not sure um, if they're ever fundamentally resolved, because, you know, and also the feeling of, do you really want them to be resolved? I mean, do you really want to never eat again?
Mhm.
Eating is a relationship between absence and excess. Do you want to never have sex again, or do you never want to have ideas again? These are all sort of relationships between absence and excess, but I do think that there's a way in which, um, in some sense, these absences and excesses can be contained by a higher order becoming, or what I might call the drive,
Mm.
which is that the drive, like, so in the way I think about the drive, we could also frame this in terms of the concept of becoming, but the concept of the drive is basically a parallax shift on the nature of desire. So in the mode of desire, you always kind of want to achieve or satisfy your object of desire. So there's always this sort of end in mind.
Mm.
With drive, it kind of enjoys its own motion. And so you still experience absences and excesses, but there's a qualitatively different relationship to the way you experience absences and excesses. Another way I think about this is sort of a form of becoming that contains its own life and death, or its own birth and death.
Mm.
But that it requires, like, sort of going to the ground of your childlike impulses, and also confronting your own finitude and mortality. But there is a form of becoming, or a form of drive, I think, on the other side of engaging this spiritual dimension.
Yeah, I think there's a quote by Nietzsche where he said, "It's in the end, it's the desire that we love, not the desired." Something like that. Might be getting it wrong, but
Yeah, the
um,
desire to keep desiring.
yeah. So, uh, one of the things I want to bring into the conversation, maybe as a final topic, is this notion of masculinity, because so much of what we've described to me, and so much of I think what Nietzsche offers is kind of like the masculine mode of being. And to be honest, I don't have a very coherent explanation for what I mean by that. I have more of an impressionist painting in mind when I think of something
Mm.
like masculinity. I imagine you have a tighter definition. But just to tie in some of the stuff we've discussed already, this like self-overcoming, this voluntary acceptance of hardship, this asceticism, um, the coming to terms with death, like looking at the void, um, putting pressure on yourself willfully, competition, testing yourself. Um, Overcoming implies hierarchy. Um, all of these things to me are on the masculine end of the masculine feminine continuum. And there's so many things I want to riff on here. But first, Uh, do you agree with this intuition that this has been kind of a theme in the discussion? And second, what is your definition or favorite definition of masculinity?
Okay, so I do sort of see there's a reason why so many young guys like Nietzsche.
Hmm.
Right? Like he resonates with a certain character. He resonates at a certain time in life for some people. Um, eh, I don't think it's a coincidence that when a lot of guys' sexual drive is coming online in a major way, um, that they find something attractive about the mode of being that Nietzsche is offering, and the ethic that he's offering, and these types of things. Um, and it's true that many dimensions of his philosophy give you a sense of an affirmation of competition,
Hmm.
and hierarchy is a positive thing, and these are things that are usually more associated with a masculine spirit. Um, in terms of the way I try to think through masculinity and femininity in a technical sense, is basically starting with the the Freudo-Lacanian tradition of psychoanalysis, where there is Freud starts with the idea that the libido is masculine, and he defines the libido as masculine in the sense that it's an action-oriented energetic impulse, and femininity is kind of the tradition. So let's go even deeper. So in the ancient world, the traditional definitions of masculinity and femininity were based on the active and passive principle.
Mm.
So this is where Freud derives the metaphysics of these paradigms, is active and passive. And it's of course a little more complicated because there are forms of feminine expression which are, I would call, passively active or actively passive. Like a good example is like if a woman is like, for example, if my my partner spends a lot of time doing makeup and dressing up, there's a way in which, even if, like, for example, a woman goes out to a club or goes out with her friends, she might not approach the man,
Hmm.
but she acts passively in the way she dressed up, in the way where she puts herself, way she opens herself to a man. There's a activity there. And naive masculinity doesn't see that.
Mm.
Like, naive masculinity thinks they're acting. It's like, no, she's already acted. She's already open to you, right? She's already said yes in some sense, or she's already, so that's the action in the passivity. But there's a way in which, under this paradigm of libido being masculine and femininity being this type of mystery of the libido.
Mm.
It's like the object of the libido, and in terms of being the object of the libido, also the failure of the object, right? Being rejected, um, being broken up with, um, not at, and so forth. All of the vicissitudes of the sexual drive.
Hmm.
Um, it's also related to the symbolic in the sense that the masculine connects the libido to the symbolic, and the woman exists in the gaps of the symbolic. So to give you examples of what I mean by that is like, and there are even like neurological and like or I forget what discipline, probably cognitive science studies about this, is that a woman, in order to be sexually attracted to a man, needs to fall into his story.
Hmm.
So the libido needs to be connected to the symbolic. Whereas for a man can immediately see through aesthetic preference whether he wants to be with that woman or not. Like,
Right.
so there's a way in which he doesn't need to hear her symbolic story in order for sexual attraction to work, right? So and now this is not, so I want to always, today we have to make this clear,
Of
is that
course.
this is not a direct mapping onto biology, that this also functions in lesbian couples and gay couples and all different sorts of gender identifications. The point is that sexual difference appears irrespective of your gender identity. So you could have any gender identity you want, but this type of what would be called in Lacan the phallus, the phallus will appear in any constellation of identity. So, like, for example, lesbians playing with the phallus, or taking certain positions. You'll have different sort of common terminology like tops and bottoms and stuff like this.
Hmm.
All of these different terms that appear in all these types of different sexual relationships are all still different manifestations of sexual difference for psychoanalysis. And what actually psychoanalysis is getting at is not identification with a substance or like an organic substance. It's a mode of enjoyment. So there's a mode of masculine enjoyment, which is called
Hmm.
phallic enjoyment, and there's a mode of feminine enjoyment. So, and they're different forms of enjoyment. And like, for example, I can also experience feminine enjoyment, but you have to make but if it's not your dominant expression, you have to that takes a sort of spiritual work on your part to explore what is my mode of feminine enjoyment.
Right.
So that's like I mean, that's like the entry point to how I think about it.
So one of the things that came to mind there was the yin yang symbol, which I feel like represents this. I don't know if this is just my own interpretation, but the black paisley has a white dot in it, and the white paisley has a black dot in it. So, the active mode has a passive component, the passive mode has an active component, and there's some sort of dynamic there. And the other thought that occurred to me was that the active mode, the masculine mode, seems to be more comfortable with, or the mode of enjoyment involves an appreciation of antagony. And I don't know if this is technically true, but I've just noticed in my masculine relationships, whenever there's some sort of conflict, let's say a debate or a disagreement, it's actually appreciated. It leads to excitement or a form of play. And in my more feminine relationships, it's not seen as a good thing. That conflict it's like the impulse is like, let's resolve this conflict. Like, there's tension right now. This shouldn't be there. And I wonder if that connects with what you're trying to say there, or if there's another way to think about that. But where does antagony fit in with this masculine feminine polarity?
I think it's related to what I would call, we could use many words. We could use basically the vicissitudes, we could say the failure, we could see the problems of the object or objectification. And I would say I would link this back to even the difference between a scientific form of objectivity and a psychoanalytic form of objectivity. Because scientific objectivity and psychoanalytic objectivity are not the same. When we're talking about psychoanalytic objectivity, we're talking about basically the relation between the libido and its enjoyment, and the link between the libido and its enjoyment. So when it comes to conflict or antagonism, it's all in the asymmetry between the libido and its object. And this is true for men and women. So I can give some examples on the feminine side, how this manifests, because it manifests differently than many people intuitively think, which is basically in the level of the woman's own body. So for the man, it's usually in relationship to achieving a replacement for the mother, because the original love object is and now this is true for subjects, whether you're born a male or female, is that all babies want the mother.
Mm-hmm.
The babies don't want the father.
Right.
The father has a weird psychological transition that's involved in becoming a father, because our society does a disservice to men in terms of teaching about this transition, because actually the primary love object for the woman is going to switch from the man and his phallus to the baby, which is the new phallus. And men in that position usually can feel rejected or neglected in that situation.
Can you define the phallus?
Yeah, well, of course, the phallus is derived from the root of the organ,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also in Lacanian terminology, it's always in the symbolic, meaning it's always a representation of that energy. So the phallus is a representation of phallic enjoyment, but
Right.
it's always a representation. So, like for example, if you have an athlete that wins a championship and they put the trophy above their head, or they have some, or even like you hit a home run or you get a slam dunk, that's a form of phallic enjoyment. It's a
Mm,
metaphor, it's a representation of that orgasm. Even the metaphor of sports is that you put a ball in a hole,
right.
like, and you put the ball in the hole better than the other guys put the ball in the hole, right? So it's a metaphor of phallic enjoyment, and you could say in that way, or even like that you have like if you're a musician and you have the microphone,
Hmm.
right? I got the mic, I got the thing, right? I've got the, I've, and in the context of the musician or the athlete, that I mean, being the guy with the thing, it gets you a lot of feminine attention,
Right.
right? And it's not it's asymmetrical. This is crucial because you go to a music concert, and the musicians always have groupies, but it's not the same for like a Beyonce or
Yeah.
Shakira. Like they don't have male groupies like that, and they don't want male groupies like that.
Right.
Right? So it's asymmetrical. But the point is in regards to the phallus, is that for the woman also has a phallus, which is her body. It's just that the relationship with the energy is distributed differently. So men become hyper focused on their phallic enjoyment, which is at its root the penis.
Hmm.
And then it gets sublimated into different things and they become hyper focused about it, right? But it's basically the same motion of energy sublimated into a different way. With the woman, it's distributed throughout her entire body. So the energy is distributed throughout the entire body, meaning that what happens in puberty, you start doing makeup, you start doing dress, and you dress up your entire body.
Mm,
And when you dress up your entire body, you want to represent the equal thing of representing, as the phallic energy is, I'm the best looking woman,
right.
right? You go out, I'm the best looking woman, right? Or I get the most likes on Instagram, or I get the most attention on Instagram. My body gets the most attention, right? So that's basically the equivalent, and of course that energy translates into the child ultimately, um, which becomes the new object of attention, and that's really like the biggest transition in a woman's psyche, from representing her entire body as the thing to having the child as the thing. But um, the energy manifests differently, and the way in which also we're recognized and experience enjoyment operates differently because of that. Like, so for example, I've talked to many women about this, is like if they go through puberty and they don't like their own body image, they'll stare at the mirror for hours hating themselves,
Mm,
right? Or like even the condition of like anorexia, or like starving yourself, or like cutting yourself, right? This is something that's experienced far more by women than men, because they actually don't like their body. And that's actually the expression of that energy, right? They don't get the attention they want, they don't get the power they want, right? So that hits the ego. That's a hit to the ego,
mm,
which is the main tension. That's the whole reason for psychoanalysis, according to Freud, is that there's a tension between the sex instinct and the ego instinct. Is that our ego is actually like like basically think about your ideal sexual fantasy, and then think about the impotence of your ego, right? And that tension between the ideal sexual fantasy and what your ego is actually is why some people go to psychoanalysis,
mhm.
because they don't know how to resolve that tension, and that drama that ensues from the gap between the ideal image and the reality of the situation, or the reality principle. So these are usually the most intimate, and this is where psychoanalysis wrestles with objectivity. And for the man, the sexual energy is not so much, he won't like starve himself or cut his body or something like that, or stare in the mirror and hate it himself, not in the same way that a woman might, but he might be extremely insecure about his performance in bed, or his penis size, or his metaphorical phallus, namely his career, his money,
Mm.
his car, his status. These are all representations of the phallus, right? Like, if a guys get together and like, who's got, there's a hierarchy. Who's got the most money? Who's got the most attention? Who's got the most fame? Who's the most successful? Who's the most talented? Who's the best at X, Y, and Z? Right? This is all representations of the male hierarchy in a libidinal context.
I don't know if you said this or this came out in a conversation with Alexander Bard, but I think it was you. You said the modern era is a challenge to the phallus.
Mhm.
What did you mean by that?
I don't know if that was Bard saying that or me, but I can sort of, I can interpret that in my own way. The modern challenge
Hmm.
to the phallus is that, um, well, let's just take it in the most explicit, common sense language that we hear in the pop culture, is that the deconstruction of the patriarchy.
Hmm.
So the deconstruction of the patriarchy is basically a challenge to a certain historical manifestation of phallic energy. Now, there is different hypotheses about it, right? Like some people some women will walk around with shirts saying the future is feminine, or like this idea that there's going to be this polar reversal where so-called phallic energy was dominating the history, and in the future feminine energy will dominate the future. So there's like this reversal between sexual energies, and usually this reversal of sexual energies is connected to a multiplicity of gender and sexual expression. So
Hmm.
usually with like, so for example, feminist movement is usually connected with also, not just, now this is a weird thing about, this is why it's asymmetrical between phallic energy and feminine energy, because it's asymmetrical because the feminine category is not, in some sense, it holds all subaltern identities. In other words, the
Mm.
feminist movement is connected to also the LGBT plus movement, which includes men, but of a certain sexual expression, which is non-hetero sexual expression. Right? So the feminine category holds all those other categories. Right? It's part of the same struggle, at least in terms of representation. It's and also there's also going to be a whole bunch of paradoxes as it relates to the way we think about this racially. So, for example, usually it's always connected to the white heterosexual patriarchy.
Hmm.
But there's going to be a whole bunch of paradoxes when it comes to Black or Hispanic or Asian or other categories of patriarchy, right? And the way in which these identities intersect. But the modern challenge to the phallus is basically this idea that the history of civilization was mediated by the primacy of the phallic energy and the exclusion of the feminine energy. And that the feminine energy is going to be like a polar reversal, or is a polar reversal right now, where we're seeing sort of more the expression of feminine energy, even to the point where it's down to the singularity of each individual, where we all have to confront our androgynous nature.
Mm.
Like Freud would say, the unconscious is bisexual, or fundamentally we carry both identities. So, I mean, I could also go into like political analyses of like of the consequences of this potential polar reversal, with like, you have, for example, in the 20th century, you would have many metaphysical paradigms operating in a patriarchal or phallic way, trying to replace Christianity as the father. Like, Christianity is the father,
Mm.
right? Like, Christianity is, he's the ideal dad. Right? And so when you have the death of God, you have the death of the Father, and that's connected, right? Because you have the death of God, you have the decline of religion, and you also have the decline of the nuclear family paradigm of having a father in the home, right? These are all connected. And so then now you open up in the 20th century, and there's atheistic, fundamentally political paradigms which are trying to be the secular father.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, for example, Marxism or fascism would be movements, or even capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
These are all sort of phallic forces which are trying to replace the metaphysics of religion. Capitalism has so far won. Capitalism is so far, I think, the true dominant force,
Mm-hmm.
the force that we all sort of recognize as regulating the social substance of civilization universally without political ideology. So, like, you could have different political ideologies of capital, but we all have to sort of play the game of capital to some degree.
Yeah.
And the explicitly political secular phalli, like the fascist and the communist experiments, they failed. So they exhausted their potentiality, so to speak, and we don't really have new language to think about new political movements on that level, right? Like, we don't have a serious competitor to global capital in the way that those alternative political paradigms emerged in the 20th century. So that's how I see sort of what's going on.
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind there. One is that Western civilization doesn't quite have a god, but we do have a devil, and that's Hitler. And in a way, World War II and Hitler being like the worst possible being who ever existed is a defining backdrop for, I guess, like this religious substance of the West. And so there's almost, perhaps that's a generator for the skepticism of the phallus, and basically how modern life is a challenge to the phallus. So that's something that comes to mind. But what I wanted to hear you riff on is characters like Jordan Peterson, who popped up. There's a couple characters like this where they pop up. Like Peterson, I think, became like the internet's dad, and almost filled this gap of like a positive, logos oriented masculine symbol, and said pretty straightforward things that a lot of young men really needed to hear, like take responsibility for your life and
Clean up your room, bucko.
clean up your room, and
Don't forget the bucko.
Yeah,
You gotta get the bucko in there.
that's right. And I knew Peterson personally, and I went through a really strange experience with this when I realized how maligned he was by the media. And I was so shocked. And I was very naive about this too, because I remember when they first started to claim he was a neo-Nazi, I was like, oh, no, you just got to watch his lectures. Like, you guys are confused. Like, check it out. And I figured the neo-Nazi thing would just like disappear, but it didn't.
No, it got more intense.
It got more intense. And it was such a surreal experience for me to see someone that I knew personally just kind of enter the public sphere and then have this like ridiculous persona attached to him. And I'll save my thoughts for what I think has happened with his story arc, but it just made me think, like, why are people so upset about someone talking about this much needed masculine spirit in what I think was, he wasn't perfect about his communication. I think he had some flaws in the way that he delivered his message, but overall, like, a surprisingly balanced and kind of reasonable person. And I want to tie this in with a more recent character, which is Andrew Tate. And I don't know if you've ever encountered this guy, but
I know about Tate.
so the parallel I want to set up here, I just had this thought the other day that Andrew Tate is Dark World Jordan Peterson. And this is kind of like a funny take, but I think there's some truth to it. I could exonerate Peterson because I knew him. I knew the images in the media were not accurate. I can't do the same for Tate. I actually don't really know who this person is. It's like hard to make sense of these kinds of celebrity characters. But if I were to take this, kind of give him the benefit of the doubt, it just seems like he's another guy that is very intensely teaching young men the importance of this phallic energy. And he has like this Dan Bilzerian aesthetic, and he's kind of outlandish, and he's like signaling his status. He knows how to fight. He's made a lot of money, and he's also become kind of the most. It's like the similar story arc to Peterson. He exploded in a very short period of time, became the most searched person on the internet, and then he got insanely canceled. Like he's now like the most canceled person on the internet, and that kind of happened to Peterson too. They tried to cancel him in all these different ways. There's so many things I'd love to hear you riff on here, but actually, you know what? I'll just like, what do you think is most interesting in that little cloud that I just put out there?
Yeah, it's such such an interesting thing to think about. I think they are. Well, I'll say for Peterson, I agree with you that he kind of became like the internet's dad, and there was some sort of like necessary function that he was playing there in his performance. But I also think it's an example of sort of the masculine identity pushed to its extreme of self-relating paradox as well, because both masculinity and femininity. This is true for both. Like, it's not like just signaling out one, but it's both masculinity and femininity are not absolute categories. They exhaust themselves. The logic of the category exhausts itself, and you can push it to its own extreme. Like, so for example, like this, the tendency of the masculine is to sort of become the phallus. Like, you're the man. But every person who becomes the man falls. Right? So like, if you actually think you're the man, you're like almost doomed for a identity catastrophe. Because you're not the man. Like, there is no the man. Every man falls. It doesn't matter how high you get, you're going to fall. And so if you don't really know that on a deep emotional level, then you're not like, basically you're a libido which is not accounting for the void.
Right.
In like, and you think, and consequently your speech, which at one time was serving sort of a libidinal function, ends up becoming increasingly empty. Right? So you become old man yelling at clouds.
Wow.
Right. Right. So you gotta watch out for that, and that's like one of the dangers of the phallic function. In regards to Tate, it seems to me like he's exploiting the pleasure principle in a masculine image of capital. Right? Like if you behave like me, you can have Ferraris and like 10 like Instagram girls from Miami, you know, so just buy my course and you're going to have a Ferrari and 10 girls at your mansion in Malibu or something, like whatever it is. The fantasy is it's being sold, but it's explicit exploitation of the pleasure principle in the sense of our primal drives hooked up to the digital medium, and a lot of young impressionable boys looking for objects of desire that will take away the meaning crisis. Like, there's something more empty and vapid about Tate. There's also something that brings you to a deeper real than Peterson at the same time. Because Peterson was trying to sell you this image of conservative Christian meaning, sort of revived in a scientific psychological interpretation of a Christian conservatism. And that image is going to exhaust itself too. Like, that will run into its own paradoxes as well. It will sustain you for the time it might sustain you, but it's going to run into its paradoxes as well. With Tate, you're almost getting closer to the bone, so to speak. But at the same time, you're closer to the bone, and at the same time, you're closer to the sort of the specular fantasy, which will reveal its emptiness. So in either case, both pathways, I think, lead you to, in my view, a masculinity that hopefully can include the void within itself. And I think a masculinity that can include the void within itself is actually going to be the form of masculinity we need. It's not going to be the flashy, guy with with the Ferrari and the 10 Instagram girls or whatever. It's gonna be the form of masculinity that realizes that all objects fail,
Mm.
right? And that form of masculinity, and not only so it's the form of masculinity that not only realizes all objects fail, but continues to move in the world with a high energy and a high ethic,
Hmm.
right? If you know all objects fail and you continue to move with a high energy and a high ethic, that's the masculinity I'm looking for. That's the masculinity I'm trying to be.
Yeah. So I
Does that
think
make
a question comes to mind, which I think might be a nice closing question. And for context, this was on my mind because I had a conversation with Jordan Hall last week where we were talking about death, and he had said in a couple locations, a couple podcasts, that the most important thing that anyone can do right now is to come to terms with their death. And I remember when I first heard him say that, I was like, wait, what? Like, that's possible? You know, that's a move on the chessboard of human life. I thought we were all destined to kind of be in some vague denial of death. And so we had a chat about this.
Shout out Ernest Becker.
Yeah, exactly.
Shout out Ernest Becker.
Very, very depressing
That's
book.
the homie right there, man.
He said that first, not everyone can do this, right? Not everyone is in a position where they're able to do that. You know, maybe you haven't encountered loss, or you know, your life is just not in a position where you're close enough to death. But he gave the example of the Navy SEALs, where they're trained to live as if they have already died, because that's essential for the mission. You know, if you go into the mission that is already going to be life-threatening and you're afraid of dying, then you're going to perform poorly. And to me, this maps on in a kind of more visceral way to what you just said about the kind of masculinity that we need, a type of masculinity that is still mission-oriented, vital, going forward, but is fully viscerally aware that these objects will fail, that they will fail, they will die. And you know, we riffed on how do you do that, right? Like, how do you come to terms with your own mortality? The SEALs, they create a culture. You know, they have an initiation ritual, Hell Week. Some people actually die in Hell Week, so it's a very real rite of passage. There's been deaths in the past, and then you enter a brotherhood on the other side of it, where everybody is reaffirming this certain unique kind of identity, where death is very salient to you. And then you lose some of those brothers in battle. So that makes sense. I understand how, you know, if you and I went through something like that, if we survived something like that, we probably would be really aware of our own death and probably would be in a better place to come to terms with it. But I guess my closing question to you is, how do you think about death, and have you come to terms with it?
Right. Yeah, it's I would say it's probably the most fundamental aspect of my philosophy. There was a tagline I had when I first joined the intellectual deep web, which was die again, die better.
Hmm.
I actually took that from Samuel Beckett, but you know, the idea of die again, die better was almost to affirm death, but with the die again, die better. It's a metaphorical death of your identity, and also this idea that on the other side you come out almost pure. I don't know if pure is the right word. you you're deeper, or you have the possibility to be more real. And words are difficult here, but in terms of sort of how I've sort of processed my own death, I think a lot of it was related to those void practices I was telling you about on the other end of my PhD, whether it was the fasting, whether it was the meditation, whether
Hmm.
it was the abstinence and the celibacy, because it's sort of like a subtraction of my life energy. It's sort of an identification with the void, but it's also in sort of the confrontation with my father's death, the confrontation with my grandfather's death, who passed away um, just a year and a half ago, and my father passed away in 2017, and having a chance to move through those deaths. When in my grandfather's case, I was at his side, you know,
Hmm.
when he died, and there was sort of like a passing on in which we, you know, he was there. He was there for me throughout my entire childhood, and I was there for him at his end, and sort of just puts your whole identity into a different context, and puts your whole identity into a different frame of mind. But then on the other side of things, not just sort of developing a philosophy which takes death as sort of like a fundamental aspect, like I was telling you about this weird tension between life and death. I don't have all the answers to what this tension ultimately is about, but um it I think it involves, in the positive aspect of things, forming relationships in what I would call libidinal economic context, which are unto death.
Mm.
Uh, and that's a constraint that you put on yourself, not because of God, not because of religion, not because of any traditional meaning, but because of those relationships. And the interesting thing about those relationships is that those are the only relationships that become irreplaceable relationships, because you can have many partners, but you can't replace a certain history, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's I think the thing that a lot of people are going to have to come to realize in the younger generation is that you can replace people. You can have many different sexual partners and so forth, but you can't replace a certain history. You only get one of those and you lose a partner, you lose that history. You can't get that back. You can get a sexual partner again, but you can't get that history back, right? So basically, in that libidinal economic context, you start with the sexual drive, but you build out from the sexual drive towards a network of, if you're a whatever, if you're a man, a brotherhood, like you were saying with the Navy SEALs, there's a brotherhood and there's a team and there's a project.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in the case of a romantic partner, whatever your sexual orientation, it's sort of it doesn't have to be actual in the sense that, I mean, you actually go into death. It's more the ethic or the ethos that this is unto death. I'm not giving up on this,
Mm-hmm.
right? Something might happen where you have to part. Something could happen, but the most important thing is the ethic or the ethos that this is unto death. I'm not giving up on this. We're gonna and what you gain by doing that is you gain the capacity to work through inner negativity. So like a lot of people, and like this again, so like let me take it back to the example I was saying in the sexual reel, where you like things aren't going the way you want, but you don't know how to express it, and you're brought to really childlike impulses, like like, why do I have to say this? Why do I have to talk about this? Or why do I have to go to the if you're in a long-term relationship and you want to keep the sexual vitality throughout the long-term relationship, you have to have those conversations. You have to go to the core of things. You have to challenge your most childlike impulses. So ultimately, what it's about in terms of building those relationships unto death is ultimately about becoming uh, a mature adult who's capable of moving through contradictions of identity and overcoming oneself.
Mm-hmm.
Like Nietzsche even says in the Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he first tries to proselytize his message to a marketplace, and then he realizes he was an idiot, and he says, I just got to go find my friends. I got to find companions. And he tries to find companions, right? Where he can have a more targeted overcoming with his friends, and that's what he ultimately, points towards. But yeah, I suppose that's something that I've been trying to work through as a fundamental part of my spiritual development in the last, say, like 5 or 6 years of life, basically coming out of a place of almost like an atemporal void,
Mm.
coming out of an atemporal void, and then like coming back to the world and temporality, and sort of having this organization of time by death.
Cadell, thank you so much for this conversation.
All right, thank you for having me.
Is there anything you'd like to leave the listeners with? Anything you'd like to share?
If you're interested in learning more about my work and what I do, the best place to find me is on philosophyportal.online. I'm trying to build a space which can explore what I have been calling the foundational discourses of the modern world. Um, And exploring those foundational discourses to me is about, in some sense, reestablishing a mature, the best possible phallus we can establish.
Mm,
That's what I'm, and it's a, it's like the guys who are going to Andrew. If there was as much energy going to Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson as there are going to Philosophy Portal, that's my mission.
amazing. Well, I want to support that mission and help direct as much of that energy as possible.